Hi, I'm here today with Pastor Paul Kim and Pastor John Cha from Open Door Presbyterian Church, and so glad to be here. Thank you for spending the time, Pastor Paul and Pastor John.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes. Pastor Paul, we'll start with you. I think a lot of people know, and we have an article up on our website, but can you give us a brief history of ODPC?
Well, ODPC was founded in 1984, and I became a senior pastor in 1992. So I've been here 32 years. The Pastor John Cha's father founded this church 1984. And I came here actually after he passed away. A friend of mine was a senior pastor, but he resigned after slightly over 1 year. And then he happened to go to a Namseol Gyoe in Seoul. Yeah. So
who was that?
Taekwon, Kim Taekwon Moksa.
Kim Taekwon Moksa. Okay.
Yeah. And then, so I came here as kind of a 2-year contract. And just I was invited to lay some foundation for their next generation. Back then, it was more likely college and very few young adult ministry for foundation, because I was not really thought that I was called into the immigrant church, because I have a very similar background like you. I came US a little bit later age, but I went last part of my high school and college. I'm also a trained engineer. And then I went to the Trinity for my theological training for MDiv and THM, and did most of the DMin, but I didn't finish that. So then I came out, and after 2 years, make a long story short, that senior pastor was supposed to come, cannot come. So they asked me to consider to be a senior pastor, and I became a senior pastor. And I told my elders that, one of the reason, actually only reason that I will stay with the immigrant first generation church is because I like to build interdependent church. Back then, we just used it, but we did not know what it's gonna look like, but just the 2 generation coexisting. So that was how we started. And PJ, when did you come on board?
I came in 1996.
1996.
Yes.
So we had some hiccup, and then PJ and Pastor John joined us, and he's been with us many years. And Pastor John has a very interesting history, because he's been head pastor, senior pastor of that, we call it EC, English Congregation, twice, but he's now not a head pastor. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, so I'm now the Congregational Care pastor. So because I have about 20 plus years of relationship with our congregation, so I'm serving in that capacity. But as Pastor Paul shared, it was in 1990s, in the 90s, when Pastor Paul, 96, where he was sharing more about this vision. But as he also shared, we did not know, if you asked us exactly what it would look like, we would not be able to give an answer. But one of the things I think Pastor Paul really emphasized and just happened in our staff was relationship building was the priority. So at that time, our church staff, the entire church was 5 people. Mm-hmm. We had meals every single day. We did not talk about ministry. We just caught up with each other. And I think it was to the point where all 5 of us could almost like read each other's minds in terms of ministry and like expectations. And I think that was very, very helpful. Pastor Paul very gracious to me as a young 20-some-year-old pastor. Always had an open door policy for me to come in. There's a funeral coming up. How do you preside over a funeral? There's a conflict among my leaders. How do you deal with that? And that was very key. And that happened for about 10 years before we even really moved towards made any concrete changes with interdependence.
So when we started, actually, one of the reasons that Young Knox and those large churches not succeeding with the interdependent model is because their Korean congregation is too large. So when we started, this was a very small church. We had a congregation all together with the children. I think we're under 500. So it was a very small church, but we had a vision of building future church together. And then also we had an urgency. Because, you mentioned about Toronto Young Knox. Mino is a good friend of mine. So we are one of those few 1.5 generation pastors who dreamed about this because out of urgency. We thought back then, 30 years ago, if we don't do anything, more than 60% or even more so of a Korean American church will shut down. But you know that what happened with IMF and millions of the Koreans came in, non-family related immigration, right? So that's how that Korean American church survived so far. So, God can do a lot of miraculous things, but if it didn't happen, we knew that we had that urgency. And then I have a great heart for immigrant church because I became a Christian through the immigrant church. So that's how we started.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, when I talk to a lot of EM pastors and others as well, just congregants, the reputation, Pastor Paul, that precedes you are very favorable. And it's not often that people say, oh, I want to work in a church like that or in a staff like that. So I think, Pastor John, what you're saying is still resonates with a lot of people. Now, I want to be precise. Is your church one church with two congregations or two churches on one campus? So is it because you said in the article a few years ago that it's particularized, and in church polity that means to a legal entity. So can you explain?
Yeah, so I'll share, and then Pastor Paul, you could add more if I'm missing anything. So we are legally one entity. We are Open Door Presbyterian Church. We do consist of two congregations. So we have ODPC KC, Korean speaking congregation, ODPC EC, English speaking congregation. Everything in terms of the IRS, everything, we are registered as one church. We own the property together. And we actually put this in our bylaws. If either congregation leaves, they surrender the property. So we do not fight over the property. This is ours or your. They just will leave the property. We do have two sets of, and just to go a little bit more into our organization, we do have two sets of staff, KC and EC, but we meet jointly. We have two sets of elders, KC and EC, but every month we meet together jointly to cover joint events or matters and to collaborate. We have two sets of budgets, but we also have a joint budget where we pay together for the support together for ministries that impact both. But having said that, we also have a senior pastor whoever is the pastor of the larger congregation is the senior pastor, and they're ultimately the one who kind of is like the chairman of everything. Because if you have just two equals in every single sense, it can lead to just conflict or just uncertainty. But to have one person ultimately call the shot. That
The important
worked for
thing
our
is
model.
from the get-go, we didn't have this one. It took us 25 years plus also to get here. So when we started, we didn't have English congregation, didn't have elder board for a long time. When was the first time you guys installed the elders?
About 2007.
2007, right? So, but we respected EC ministry leaders almost like elders. So I had an annual elder board retreat with the Korean side congregation elders. We invited English side leaders, and we respectfully and had a relationship together. So we have a long history, and plus even the budget. In the beginning, we had one budget. So both congregation made their budget for the upcoming year, but whatever income came in, we had just one pot, one account. But we get to the point that it was not effective. So we decided to have what happened? We decided to have a separate bank account, a separate elder board, but we do have all that details written on the bylaw for the, after I'm retiring in 1.5 years.
Oh,
So I'm 64 years old. So I've been preparing that, how we're gonna decide next senior pastor, or in the future, if English congregation become larger congregation, then what happened? So we have all that written in the law that larger congregation leading pastor is chairperson. So, like when relationship goes well, that's not a problem.
right.
But you have to have someone who can make a, direction and point. And so that's how we decide.
Okay, now that's helpful. But then, so what confused me was when you said in the article interview 3 years ago, Pastor John, that
Yes.
you were particularized. Now, what denomination are you?
So in practice, we would be most in
PCA.
tune with PCA,
Uh-huh.
but we are not part of a denomination. We're
Oh.
independent
We
Presbyterian.
were actually part of the PCA. And then when I got invited, they temporarily had that, I don't know what is the term in English, but they kind of froze their relationship with the PCA so that they can broaden the invitation base for the senior pastor,
I
not
see.
from only, their denomination, but they could invite somebody else. That's how I came in. And after that, we're gonna rejoin them, but because of our vision. I don't know where they are now, because I know some Anglo, friends who's in PCA, who's been asking that join them again. But I told them that, you guys do not understand the ethnic church situation. We need to have 2 different elder board, and but still we can work together, which they never has done that. So because of that, we couldn't join any denomination. So we decided to stay independent. Yeah, I know that it's kind of oxymoron, isn't it? Like Presbyterian church without presby.
Presbyterian.
But in practice and theology, we are in line with the PCA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that helps me, because when Pastor Cha, you said that you were particularized, it wasn't particularized within a presbytery.
No.
Denominational particularized. But it is within your own internal framework. We're recognizing the EC as their own kind of a body that they can make decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's I guess it would be like if you had a home and your child got married and say, okay, we're gonna, on the same land, we're gonna have two homes, and we're gonna recognize you as the head of your own household, but we're gonna live in this, land together.
Yes, Pastor Steve, and I apologize for that confusion with that language, but it is just like he said. Actually, when our EC did become much more independent with our own elders and with our own budget and everything, that what you just shared is the narrative we used.
Right.
Because we knew that the KC side and the elders were actually experiencing that within their own homes. Because at that time, their kids were getting married and were moving away, but not too far away, because they wanted to still be together. And we borrowed that analogy and said, hey, the EC, we're so grateful that we've grown under the care of the KC. Now we are two congregations, still one church, one family, one vision. But how we practice that and how we're going to pursue that vision is going to be, we're going to have our own generational context to be able to pursue that. And the KC blessed us, and so we're still together, but we do have a lot more autonomy and freedom to express it uniquely to who we are as a congregation.
Now, I have so many. Pastor John, you seem like an organizational person, like you think strategically, organizationally. Is that accurate?
Only because I have to, being in this position, but naturally, I'm much more of a relational, but I do think of it that way.
How about you, Pastor Paul? Is it because of your engineering background that you think that way?
I am actually,
okay.
Very organizationally oriented. So 30 years ago, our friends like that Mino and Peter Cha and all, we talked about this dream, but theory was out there, but nobody was really practicing. So, or maybe they did and they failed it. So we practiced it long enough to develop all the system. Having what I have in my mind is that this is a sample. I don't think this is the every way everybody has to do it, but at least that they can benchmark our church. And we like to set a very good example and good sample. So, but like when we started, we only had one building.
Right.
Yeah, but the Lord's been very gracious. We have a large campus. We have a 16-acre land. So, but even that, you mentioned that if you joined with your previous Korean congregation, you would have always afternoon service. But us, we didn't do that. We carved out prime time on Sunday to English congregation meet on our main sanctuary.
I believe we had the 9:30 slot with the main sanctuary for us, which said a lot about the Korean side.
Yeah, back then, they were not even that large congregation. Our sanctuary is about 700 seating capacity. I think their congregation was less than 300, but we thought it's just a language. And then also respect. Those are the kind of things far more important than just Korean congregation outgrowing them. Because back then, around that time, this community was exploding. So church was basically, we are welcoming 100+ people every month. Wow. So we're like growing really fast, but we decide to sacrifice our numerical growth for the sake of building foundation for our vision. So that's why leadership decide to give them 9:30 in the morning. So we had a 8 o'clock service, and then they had a 9:30 service. We had a 11 o'clock service, 1:30 service, like that. Right. So that's how we did. And then English congregation grew and matured. They were ready to have their own building. And they,
so when we pursued our own building, the cost of the building was about $7 million. So the EC said, we will take care of the whole building campaign and take care of the mortgage. But when we applied for the building code, the county said, then you need to expand your parking And that parking project would cost about 3.5 million. So we said, that's a lot for us. So then the Korean side said, actually, we need to expand the parking anyway, but we want to bless it with the building. We'll take care of the 3.5 million parking. And then we took care of our own 7 million building campaign. And so we're very thankful that we could grow together in this way.
So now let me pose a slightly different scenario. And Pastor Paul, you said, well, this is a model, a case.
A sample.
Yeah,
Yes.
a sample. It won't necessarily work for all, and in fact, it doesn't. And they can have the same heart, mind, and humility and godliness. They love Jesus, but it doesn't work for. And one of the things I talk about is the field condition. You can have a great set of architectural drawing, but the field conditions might be different for a different church or different setting. Now, going back to my case, we were worshiping at 9:30. And so when the Korean church went to the new property, et cetera, they would have given us a 9:30 service time, but I was projecting the long run.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
I
if we kept going, yeah, that's just not a tenable situation. There's a parking situation, et cetera, et cetera. If we develop our own Christian ed, there was just a limited room to grow. Now, let's go back in time and let's say you didn't buy a 16-acre property, but you were at a 6-acre property and there was no opportunities to build a second sanctuary. What would you have maybe proposed or strategized in that case? Because that's a situation that a lot of churches are in, actually. They don't have the opportunity to do what you did.
I mean, another option is you could rent building near to your campus. By the way, that we have only one Sunday school. So we do not have an English Congregation Sunday School or KC. We intentionally build just one Sunday school so that both congregation can send their children there. And we believe that church is not a cultural center, but church is where gospel need to be taught with a language they can understand the best.
Right.
So yes, I had some uphill battle in the beginning, but our Sunday school using English anyway, so we did not need to have two Sunday school.
Right.
And then at one point, as we go through, this was not originally church building. This was a computer science corporation building. So since we purchased just the commercial building, as we go through the remodeling, we had some conflict with the city. So we were basically kicked out of the building for almost 8 months. So we have to worship in separate location for about 8 months. After that, our English congregation, they could have decided that, hey, we are not going to join you again, but they decide to join us. So I think, yes, if you have a property like us, it helps, but it is more than property. If you have that, your dream is bigger, and then you can both find out the way you can run and sacrifice it. So since we were not in the shoes, I cannot tell you exact solution, but like realistically, when I see the churches, a lot of immigrant churches, not necessarily English congregations over 1,000 members or that large. So it could have worked out if you leadership is one accord, and if you have the humility to really serve for the kingdom. The reason we are deciding, one of your question was about disciple making. Korean congregation wants to disciple Korean immigrant and English congregation for either Korean American or other Asian Americans. I agree with that, but also not totally, because I believe discipleship is a method to get to the bigger goal, which we believe that existence of the church, the reason for existence of the church is for world mission. So For us, that mission is the bigger picture. For that, if we cannot sacrifice each other here, we are actually being hypocrite, saying that we want to go to third world where different culture, different language, we like to disciple them, we like to build the kingdom of God. It really doesn't go well. So we had a willingness to sacrifice each other for the sake of the world mission.
Thank you. So if like part of what you're saying is that if circumstances are slightly different and you didn't have 16 acres, et cetera, that if the priority was, hey, mutual sacrifice so that we can stay together, et cetera, it could be that the EC could rent a school down the street and things of that nature, that
Yes.
would have been the second best option. And
we actually practiced that for many years before we move out here.
Right.
We used to have a very small campus. There was a 1 acre land. And fortunately, we had a high school across from our building. So English congregation, they met in the auditorium, and we met in our sanctuary. Sanctuary wasn't large enough anyway. So we practiced that for a while until God granted us with this property.
Now, Pastor John, I'm sure you talk to EM pastors all over, frequently and on many occasions, and they would probably privately tell you, boy, it's really hard being with the KM. And in terms of, fleshly speaking, while, the dictatorial, they change plans, they treat us like juniors, and the elders yell at me, things of that nature, right?
Right.
They don't know that, most Korean pastors experience the same thing too, but
Right.
But one of the things that they would share is like, hey, I feel like I've been called, like I mentioned in my little questions that I sent, to make disciples of the community, whether it be Korean Americans or Asian Americans or the multi-ethnic community. That's what we feel like we've been called to do. That's our primary mission. But the Korean church expects us to help them with their primary mission of taking care of their children and youth. And that's how, at least that's how a lot of the EM churches feel.
Yeah.
What is your response to them? What would you tell them? Because that is their reality in many cases.
Yeah. I'll share, I guess I could only share through our journey. I think for us, because we built it, and this is after much discussion, when we said one vision, 2 households and 1 family, that 2 households, it's kind of literally, Pastor Steve, your kids can now invite non-Korean friends over to their home. And they don't always have to smell doenjang or kimchi, right? Because they're now just at the home of your kids. Our side, we do have more non-Koreans who are coming to our Sundays, as well as to our gospel communities or our small groups. And we're able to disciple them with no problems. They're more than welcome. Having said this, and I do want to speak for the KC side, they're actually getting some non-Koreans as well. And so to the point where I believe, Pastor Paul, you have several small groups, grace communities, or that are English speaking in your congregation. And then now on the Korean side, they have headphones for translation. So I think overall, our church is now at a place where both sides are kind of being much more open to non-Koreans. In terms of us feeling like we're focusing on their kids or taking care of their kids, I actually did talk to our congregation. This was about 15 years ago, when there was talk about, can we separate? Can we just focus on our kids and they focus on their kids? And I did make a statement where I just said, their kids are going to become us in about 10 years.
Mhm.
So if there's a best practices, if there are resources, let's not just keep it to ourselves. Let's share, because those kids will be us. Last year, I served interim with our college ministry, and I had a core of 6 young adults who poured into the college students. All 6 of them were children of the KC side. And I was their counselor when they were going through the youth group. And I was so thankful because our EC side, our kids are still in college. So in a few years, I hope they'll be able to serve the rest of the college students. So there is this intertwining that's already taken place. In terms of reaching out to multi-ethnics, I think the role of our church, and I both Pastor Paul and I, we cheer for multi-ethnic churches. But for us, our hearts are for the ethnic immigrant church, where people who have just come together, or they're kind of growing together. But what breaks our hearts is when they just leave on really bad terms, and those who leave do not end up going to church anymore or something like that. So we just want there to be a healthy relationship where they do experience the gospel, not just hear it, but see it within the context of life together between the generations. And that's where we feel like our model can speak into other ethnic churches. And then perhaps 10 years later, they go for a different direction. That's completely fine with us. We just want there to be health and this foundation for a family as a church in the beginning.
What
Going back to
I'm sorry,
the
go ahead.
question that you asked, I've been in both shoes. I was under first generation leadership, and I was youth pastor for youth/college pastor for 7 years. So, I don't want to make it sounds like this is kind of accusation, but both sides, we both need to humbly grow together. That requires a lot of sacrifice. And I often hear, I also personally went through that experience too, that when the English congregation with the Korean congregation together, when English congregation is not growing, I often hear that from the English congregation pastor saying that we are not growing because of first generation congregation is dominant, right? We hear that very often, but in my experience, I look back, it was not, yes, there are some, I'm not denying that, but because we were not mature leader yet, and then also sometimes we have to be patient for the God's timing. So, for instance, there was a time that when Korean congregation was investing for the English congregation, not necessarily they are the children of the Korean congregation, but we, as we said, we go to the third world, no relationship. We invest all those things to serve them. And if we cannot serve, maybe they are not blood related, our own children, but they're same culture, same background. If we cannot serve them wholeheartedly, then we're contradicting ours, to go to work,
Right.
their work. So I emphasize that a lot with our leadership. They bought into that. So we practice that, and both sides, if we're willing to sacrifice. I'm a grandfather like you. Now that one of my children, they moved out here from Seattle and living with us because their house is not completed yet. It is hard as a parent. They took all my spaces and I don't have a privacy, but, we just grow together through that. So I wish that we both can endure together a little bit longer, then we'll see more fruit of the interdependent church.
So I'm going to summarize a few of the things that I think I heard from both of you. Number one is when EC pastors are talking about their frustration with the KM, et cetera, and their inability to reach the multi-ethnic community. I've heard two things from both of you. It's like one thing is that that perhaps at least for ODPC, that your goal and the niche that God's given to you is the ethnic immigrant church, and you're okay with that. And secondly, I'm kind of reframing it, that really you need to be a healthy church more than anything else. If you're a healthy church, there's a chance that you'll reach the non-Koreans, even if you have a Korean-speaking church. But if you can't get along just even with the differences, the cultural language differences within the Korean immigrant community in the second generation, how are you really preparing to do world missions if you can't practice what you're preaching here? One of my friends used to say that the first potential church split in Acts chapter 6 was an intra-ethnic split between the Hellenized and Hebraic Jew. And they had to resolve that, and it kind of reminds us of the KM and EM. And so, thank you so much for those thoughts. And by the way, when I'm speaking, I love the Korean church, and I wanted to be alongside of the Korean church. I wish it would have logistically worked out, and I love and respect Pastor Song Songgang Muksa님. And in fact, when I graduated seminary, I had offers from some large churches. One of them was from the East Coast, actually, not too far from you. But I wanted to work with someone that I can just respect and trust. And that's why I came. Oh, and I also agree with you, Pastor Paul, that when English pastors often complain that they can't grow because of the KM, what I would say to them, maybe directly or indirectly, you're not growing because you don't have game. That's just a peripheral issue. In fact, the Korean congregation is probably helping you to grow more than you think, because they're feeding post-high school students into your congregation. And so, I think sometimes English pastors, they forget the benefit that comes with being alongside of the KM, but they focus more on the negative. And then when they get out there, become their own church plant at elementary schools, they complain about not having no facility, the childcare, and all those types of things. Can I ask the two of you, if you're sitting with a group of English pastors, and they're talking about their situations, and you've already mentioned a lot of those things, but there are some situations you think, when you listen to them, for you, interdependency may not work for whatever different reasons. It sounds like philosophically the KM doesn't think that way, or that your personal drivenness is going to interfere, that maybe it is better to, and I tell people, if you can't be a cooperative EM, but you won't leave, you're being a squatter, you're being parasitic, you're not being helpful. Just go then. Don't stay and complain all the time. If you're sitting with a bunch of EM pastors, what would you like? What would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Pastor Steve, that's squatter and parasitic. That's you're being very Old Testament prophet there. So for me, I would say have a heart-to-heart talk with the senior pastor, and if it's much more of an elder driven church, sit with the elders. What do they even have a dream? Do they have a desire and a dream to raise a second generation properly and in a healthy way? And if they say no, then I would just say, then do another search for a pastor who's fine with that. But I'll stay and I'll serve until you find that person. But I would make a plan to leave. Now, if they say yes, we just don't know how, then for me, I'm much more of a I'll work with you. And if it takes 20 years, for me, I personally will stay those 20 years to help with the church.
But Pastor John, I know of no Korean pastor who will say that they don't have a heart and vision for the next gen. They all do. But the way that they envision it may be different.
So I think this is where, so what was always difficult for our church, ODPC, was we didn't have other churches that were 10 years ahead of us.
Right.
So that we could say, hey, here are the mile markers. Here are the things that were really helpful, things that we could do away with, whatever, based off of this case model. At least with our church, what we can offer, there is a conference, and we offer multiple conferences where we invite the first gen leadership and the second gen leadership, almost like the senior pastor and an elder, the second gen pastor and an elder, and the four of them come and they could look at our church, just critique our church, ask the hard questions, and then we give them time at the conference for the four of them to just talk it out and then decide. And if they are for it, we will offer whatever resources to help them. Again, not that they would be clones of our church, but at least through our church, they could ask, okay, this can work, or this definitely won't work, or at least they have something to react to, versus they have nothing to even talk about because everything's theory.
Yeah.
So we just
like
offer
the benchmark that Pastor Paul is talking. And if you can give me information on the conference offline, that would be helpful. We'll include that. Pastor Paul, but at a conference like that, when you're sitting with first and second generation leaders and you're hearing their heart, but I'm sure there are times in God, well, for you guys, that's not going to work. Are there situations like that, or other situations go, oh, but I see a lot of potential in your situation?
Well, I think I recently actually did some consultation for the large immigrant church. What I sensed from their leadership is, both sides has hurt because they've been betrayed from each other. And then also that they have not been exposed to the very healthy model.
Right.
So what we encourage them is our conference we do biannually. What we are doing is that we just like to show them, hey, it can happen. Look, it happened to us. We're nothing. I'm not any extraordinary leader. It's just very ordinary people, love the Lord, love the kingdom, and that God blessed us where we are. And patience, and then also using us as benchmark. They don't have to go make the same mistake. And just that's what we're trying to do is give them a message of the hope. Hey, at least to try for a certain period of time before you just throw the towel in. So a lot of them, I think it is because they don't know how to do it. And then also they do have that hurt from the past and the fear for failure in the future. So if we can coach them a little bit better, I think right now the immigrant churches, they are much more willing to work together
than in the past.
Yeah, in comparing to the past. I remember in the past, I've been in the church who just have no willingness. And I even remember that one of the chairperson of the elder board, came visit me individually to apologize. So he apologized, the way we treated you. So now I think that is much better time to try it. So instead of just keep on hearing or just looking back for, looking at all those past failure, I'm not saying that every church, this is a workable model. That's what I meant by it. But if they have a humility, if both party willing to try it, I like to recommend them to do it. Hey, let's do it for maybe 5 years, 6 years. And then we're gonna reevaluate and decide, are we gonna move forward or, take the reality and saying that, hey, I don't think it's gonna work for us. But many of them, without even trying, out of the fear and of the non-knowing, I think so many of them are giving up too early.
I do think, Pastor Steve, like what we said at the very beginning about our model relationship is really important. And I guess as Pastor Paul shared, if there's a breach of trust, past hurt, a lot of baggage that is not being released, then that I would say that can just shut the door really quick. And the congregation can tell when the pastors don't get along, when the elders don't get along. The congregation can tell, and they won't take those extra steps towards their first or second gen brothers and sisters in the church either.
Let me just share with you one particular memory that I have. Early stage of our ministry, I only had one assistant guy. And then the PJ, after he resigned, PJ joined me. It was a small church. I was a senior pastor / janitor. So when it snows, I slept in the office Saturday night, got up early Sunday morning, clean up the driveway and stuff. Yeah. Most of the, forgive me if I am too judgmental, most of the EC pastors, do you think that they will make a sacrifice to join me? They would not, right? No. But John volunteered. Pastor John volunteered. After he found out that I was staying, he volunteered that I'm gonna stay. And we don't know how much snow, we don't get snow that much here, so people get scared. So then we got up in the morning, we clean up the driveway a little bit so that whoever willing to come to the church, be able to worship with us. So I think that's the kind of both side. I think that is a very good picture of humility and respecting each other for the kingdom and working together. If you can go out of your way without me asking if they offer, that's the kind of way you build a relationship. And, so that's how we came together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I noticed about the second gen pastors is that they're so focused on what they believe God's called them to do. And they neglect the way that they can serve even their Korean senior pastors. And another one of my pet peeves is second gen pastors talk about how the first gen pastors aren't mentoring them. But Korean mentoring is different from the English mentoring. Korean mentoring is just you spend time, you follow the senior pastor around, and that's you learn by seeing him in action. But they complain because, well, that's not in my job description. Why are you making me do that, or things of that nature? But hey, thank you so much.